For Catholics, we either have to follow the Heiliger Geist or the Zeitgeist, right? We either have to follow the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of the age. And what modernism does, it thinks the church should move with the times. And what G.K. Chesterton says, we don't want a church that will move with the world, we want a church that will move the world.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Hello, I'm Rafael. Welcome to Literary Catholic. Our guest today, I'm happy to announce, is Joseph Pearce. Now, as you will soon hear, if you didn't know already, Professor Pearce is originally from England. He is an acclaimed author with 30 published books, including the bestsellers The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon, and the Church of Rome, Tolkien, Man and Myth, and his most recent work, Classic Literature Made Simple, 50 Great Books in a Nutshell. Professor Pearce is the editor of the St. Austin Review and an international lecturer, and he currently serves as visiting professor of literature at Ave Maria University and as visiting fellow at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire. Professor Pearce is a Catholic convert, and he writes extensively on Christian and Catholic subjects, and his personal website is jpearce.co. That's jpearce.co. Joseph, if I may call you that, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, Joseph, my intention is to spend most of our conversation talking about your last 3 books, but I want to start with your life, because as some of our viewers and listeners may know, there was a fundamental, important transformation in that life that you experienced. I had already read a few of your books, a couple of your books at least, when I learned from reading your autobiography, Race with the Devil, that in fact in your youth, for a number of years in your youth, you had been a British nationalist, a white supremacist, a racist, in fact. And that for a number of those years, when you're involved in that, you were actually a leader of possibly the premier white nationalist organization in Britain, the National Front. Now, I definitely want to get into how you got from there to here. But let's begin with how you got there in the first place. What were the factors? What were the influences that led you to that dark world when you were just a teenager?
Yeah, so as my autobiography, the title says it all in a nutshell. Race with the Devil, my journey from racial hatred to rational love. So that was the journey. So how did I find myself as someone who was eaten up by racism and racial hatred as a young man? Well, I have to be honest about it. A lot of it I learned from my father's knee. My father was a racist. He was also a very, very good man. I try to grapple with that in my book. That he was actually very loving. He actually loved his fellow man. So he hated in the abstract and loved in the concrete. If any person he met, irrespective of the color of their skin, he treated with the dignity of the human person. But he could hate groups very, very easily. So I grew up as a racist. I also grew up being very anti-Catholic. My father was very prejudiced against the Catholic Church. So at the age of 15, I joined a white supremacist organization called the National Front. And very quickly, I became the youngest member of its governing body and the chairman of the Young National Front, so the youth movement of the organization, I think by the age of 17. So I joined at 15, and by 17, I was basically amongst the national leadership. And then through editing a magazine called Bulldog, I was sentenced to prison twice.
For hate speech.
For hate speech. For the actual technical charge was under Britain's Race Relations Act, publishing material deemed likely to incite racial hatred. Mm-hmm. So I was sentenced to 6 months in prison when I was 20 years old, and 12 months in prison when I was 24 years old, and I spent my 21st and 25th birthdays in prison. And parallel with that, I was very heavily involved with the anti-Catholic terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland. So I knew the leadership of the UDA, I was involved with the UVF, and was also a member of an anti-Catholic secret society called the Orange Order, sort of a bit like an anti-Catholic Freemasons, if you like. So I was a member of that as well. So I was a long, long way from Holy Mother Church as a young man, that's for sure.
So how did that transformation happen? How did you go from that darkness to the light of the Catholic faith?
Well, nobody would have induced me to read a Christian book, and nobody would have induced me especially to read a Catholic book. But I was obviously interested in politics, evidently, and economics. And I was looking for an alternative to either what we would now call globalism, corporate globalism, and Marxism, communism. I didn't like communism, but I also didn't like the world to be run by Bill Gates, whoever the 1970s and 80s equivalent of Bill Gates was, global corporations. So I was looking for a third way, should we say, and someone said if you looked at the political ideas of G.K. Chesterton. I didn't know who G.K. Chesterton was, but I picked up a book. This person recommended for one essay in it. The book was called The Well and the Shallows. And the title of the book is The Well is the Catholic Church. So it has depth, profundity, it has life-giving water. The shallows is everything else. So I'm reading this book very disoriented because I couldn't help liking Chesterton, couldn't help liking his sense of humor, his way of arguing, most of the things he was saying. But I couldn't buy into his Christianity. But I kept buying more and more Chesterton after that. In actual fact, my feeling upon first reading Chesterton was basically identical to C.S. Lewis's. When C.S. Lewis first read Chesterton when he was in the British Army in World War I, he was an atheist and very anti-Catholic. And yet he just couldn't help liking Lewis. He said it was, as Chesterton, he said it was like falling in love with someone you had no intention of marrying. So, I was exactly the same. And of course, in the end, you realize, reading Chesterton, that the reason he has these political and economics ideas are because of his philosophical and theological beliefs, because of his Catholicism. It all follows on. So bit by bit, through reading Chesterton and then Belloc and C.S. Lewis and eventually St. John Henry Newman and St. Thomas Aquinas, I was led to Catholic Church, and I was received on St. Joseph's Day in 1989 when I was 28 years old.
Now, as you said, the subtitle of the autobiography is My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. Now, your conception of rational love and your belief that faith and reason are indivisible are two ideas that I personally keep seeing in your work. And most of your work, if not all of your work, they're always there. Tell us, what exactly does that mean, and why are those ideas so important to you and to your faith?
Yeah, I think many people of my generation, and the younger generation for that matter, we feel that we have to choose between faith or reason, right? That you can be religious, but only by being irrational, or you can be rational, but only by forsaking religion. That you have to make a choice. And then what the Catholic Church has always taught from the beginning, from people such as St. Augustine, not to mention the words of the Gospel, that the faith and reason are indissolubly married. They can't be separated. If you separate them, you end up that rationalism is irrational. We end up with the atheism of Marxism or the French Revolution or the atheism of Nietzsche and the Nazis. And I sometimes say that if you take faith away from reason, you end up with the guillotine, the gulag, and the gas chamber. So faith and reason have to go together. And if you have an irrational faith, then you end up with all sort of wacky sects and weird mysticism. So the two have to be kept together. And as for rational love, there's two different understandings of love. For the world, love is a feeling, it's an emotion. Therefore, it's ipso facto irrational. But for the Christian, love is a commandment. That we are told that we must lay down our lives for the beloved, even if the beloved is our enemy. And obviously the feelings we have towards our spouse or our children or our parents or our friends or our enemies are going to vary. But it's not about the feeling, it's about the choice, the rationally choosing to lay down our lives for the beloved. And so in the end, there's only two types of love. One is of the devil and the other is of Christ. The one of the devil is that you lay down the lives of the other for yourself, narcissistically. You use people, abuse people to satisfy your erotic feelings. And the other way is to lay down your life for the beloved, sacrificing yourself for the other rather than sacrificing the other for the self. Two different types of love, and they're as far apart as heaven and hell.
Yeah. Now, the first book you published after becoming a Catholic was your biography of G.K. Chesterton, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton is the title. Now, you pushed yourself very hard to write this book under very difficult circumstances. It took you a few years to do it, but you carried on. What compelled you to write this book under these conditions? Talk about that and talk to us about the prayers that you were articulating for the book. during this period. I mean, that's far from being the most dramatic or spectacular moment of the autobiography, but I found it particularly moving, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, well, obviously, as I've just said, that under grace, I owed more to G.K. Chesterton for bringing me to Christ than anybody else. So this was an act of love and an act of gratitude. I sometimes say that I thank God for Chesterton, but also thank Chesterton for God, because under grace, I owe my conversion to him. So this was an act of love. I didn't feel that any of the previous biographies of Chesterton had really encapsulated the fullness of the man. And I felt that I could do that. But also, that this was payback time. That, I'd done so many bad things and so many things that had damaged other people during my years as a radical extremist from the age of 15 to about the age of 25 or 26, that I felt that I needed to do something which was positive and good and would actually have a beneficial impact upon people. And I remember praying to God that if this one book could be published, then I would feel that I'd done something at least worthwhile to undo all the poisonous stuff that I'd done when I was younger. And there's no way I could have imagined that not only would the book be published, but it would lead me where I've been since then, the half a century, almost 30 years since then, since the book was published. And I sometimes say that if God had given me a magic paper, a blank page to write on, you write what you want the next 30 years of your life will be. It would not be as beautiful as he's given me. Not only was that one book by Chesterton published, as you say, there's now over 30 books, and I've been living in the States, traveling around the country, giving talks, teaching, and just really trying to give back some good things for the bad things I did in my youth.
Well, you certainly have. I can attest. Now, another author that you haven't mentioned, but who also had a profound influence on you during your youth, was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, as you write, quote, would sow the seeds of faith and hope in my understanding of reality and exorcise the demons of nihilism and pessimism that lurked in the darkest recesses of my soul. Talk about how this Russian writer managed to sow such seeds in the heart of a British white racist, seeds that would grow and blossom in time.
Yeah, so when I was working full-time for the National Front, and it required 3 train journeys and a bus journey, so it's a 2-hour commute each way. So that's 4 hours reading time. And I remember reading the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago in 1978. I was 17 years old. And of course, I was anti-communist, so I liked the fact that Solzhenitsyn was against the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime, and it was an anti-Marxist. But when I started reading Solzhenitsyn, he was much more than that. He was much deeper than that. And at the deepest elements of who that man was, apart from his courage, his fortitude, was his Christianity. That his Russian Orthodox faith was at the heart of what gave him the strength to defy the might of the Soviet Empire. So he's a man who's a great, not just a great inspiration because of his courage, the one man to take on the Soviet Empire, but a man who did so because of the strength of his faith and no doubt the grace that he received through that faith. I sometimes say about Solzhenitsyn, he reminds me very much when George Orwell was writing 1984, Solzhenitsyn was in a cell at the beginning of a 7-year prison sentence, whereas Winston Smith in 1984 is defeated by Big Brother, the fictional character is defeated by the tyrant. The real life character, basically starts memorizing his writing because he had no writing materials, comes out and starts writing works that are very influential. Alongside St. John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the single figure that's responsible for bringing down the might of the Soviet Union. And that's one man in a prison. So for me, comparing Solzhenitsyn's reality with George Orwell's fiction, that fiction, truth is stranger than fiction and has a far happier ending.
That's wonderful. Now, in 1998, when you still only had the Chesterton biography under your belt, you mustered the temerity to to ask to write to Solzhenitsyn, asking him to allow you to interview him. Now, by this time, he had a reputation of being a recluse, and he was extremely suspicious by this time particularly of Western writers. Yet he said yes. Come on, interview me. Well, why did he do that? And what did that interview lead to?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I do not even know now how I managed to get his address, but I did. And he'd only been back in Russia for 4 years. And I wrote to him in his house, his address just outside Moscow. And I said that I wanted to write his biography because I didn't feel that any of the previous biographies had paid due attention to the centrality of his Orthodox faith. And then by way of a CV, what did I have to offer? Well, I'd published one book, one biography of G.K. Chesterton. And of course, I'm not expecting to get a reply, or perhaps if I get a reply, it might be thanks, but no thanks, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in which case I'd frame the letter and put it on the wall. So, what did I have to lose, really, apart from a little bit of time? But imagine my astonishment when I get a letter back saying that, yes, he would cooperate with my biography. He would be interviewed by me, gave me the address of 2 of his sons to serve as go-betweens because their English is immaculate. Now, what astonished me, I mean, why me, right, is because he had basically refused to speak to any Western journalists for about 10 years at this time because they treated him so poorly. Yeah. And then out of the blue, he says he's going to give an interview to me. This unknown person was with one book. And then when I so now I go to my publisher in the UK, HarperCollins, I wave this letter in front of them and say, you have to give me a contract to write this book, and you have to give me an extra £5,000 because I can't afford to go to Moscow unless you do. And they look at it, they're as astonished as I am, and they said, no problem. So I go there, and I'm wondering, why me? It doesn't make any sense. And then before Solzhenitsyn emerges, his wife takes me to another room and points to the Ignatius collected works of G.K. Chesterton in Solzhenitsyn's collection. So Chesterton was the magic word, I think, as well as he agreed with me that previous biographies had not paid due attention to Christianity. So he agreed with that. But then the fact that I'd written a biography of Chesterton meant that I was the right sort of person, perhaps, to write such a book. So, I mean, that's just one other thing I have to thank Chesterton for.
Terrific. Now you learned that after you published the book, he read it and he liked it. That must have been a moment of your life that you haven't forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that the one reader of my biography that was really, really cared about what he thought of it, it was Solzhenitsyn himself. And he liked it so much that when he died, I wanted to do a revised biography to bring the story up to its end. And his wife, his 3 sons, all cooperated with it, getting me materials because, he liked my biography, they liked my biography, and for me, that is the greatest tribute that my biography could have, is that the great man was happy with my humble offering, shall we say.
Terrific. Now, moving quite a few years ahead now, your most recent biography, which came out just a couple of years ago, is of another giant that you greatly admired, Pope Benedict XVI. What moved you to write his biography, and did you ever have a chance to meet him?
Well, I'd been at audiences with him, and once I was in St. Peter's, and he just walked straight past me. But no, I never did meet him. I have friends such as Father Fezio of Ignatius Pearce, who studied under him. But no, I never did meet him. But I've always admired him. I mean, to me, that obviously not just as Pope Benedict XVI, but as Cardinal Ratzinger, as we mustn't forget that St. John Paul II, virtually for the entirety of his papacy, Cardinal Ratzinger was his right-hand man. He'd appointed him, he trusted him. For me, they were the dynamic duo. If St. John Paul II was Batman, then Cardinal Ratzinger was Robin, right? And this dynamic duo were what saw the turning of the tide. Things were a mess in 1978 when JP2 became Pope. And I think of the lines of Chesterton's poem, The Ballad of the White Horse. The high tide, King Alfred cried, the high tide and the turn. And this, because he's talking about the pagan Vikings, the Danes invading England. But I think the high tide of the post-Vatican II madness that was going on in the 60s and 70s, well, JP2 turned that tide, but he turned that tide largely because of the work of the great Cardinal Ratzinger, who then became the great Pope Benedict XVI. So, when he retired, resigned from the papacy, he was sort of out in the wilderness somewhat. and I began to feel that this man needs someone to champion him. I mean, I know that there are many people that do, but it was also my hope, my own, bit like my biography of Solzhenitsyn, my own humble offering in gratitude for his greatness. You know, that he'd done so much for the church. This was my effort, and also to make sure that the people that, you know, younger people that come through now. I mean, it astonishes me. I was talking to someone on the plane coming here who's a junior at Clemson who wasn't born at 9/11, wasn't even born when 9/11 happened. So, you know, that Benedict XVI retired, you know, a long time back now. And there are many people who are in their 20s who don't remember Pope Benedict XVI. So I'm hoping that my book will make people realize what a great man he was, what a giant figure in the church in the 20th and the early 21st century.
So you kind of touched on this on your first answer, but let me be... let me try to get more specific out of you. The title of the biography is Pope Benedict XVI's Defender of the Faith. So what were some of the most sinister or dangerous foes or forces that Benedict had to defend the faith against? First, as a young scholar, brilliant scholar who participated in Vatican Council II, then as Pope John Paul's prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, as his Robin, and thirdly, as Benedict XVI.
Yeah, well, first of all, you know, he was a great theologian and never, although some people might say so, a modernist. The key thing we have to understand here that for Catholics, we either have to follow the Heiliger Geist or the Zeitgeist, right? We either have to follow the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of the age. And what modernism does, it thinks the church should move with the times. And what G.K. Chesterton says, we don't want a church that will move with the world, we want a church that will move the world. So that the church of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI was a church that moved the world. It brought down the Soviet Union. It moved the world. It wasn't trying to move with the world. Mm-hmm. And when the church tries to be fashionable, it gets itself into a mess. And Cardinal Ratzinger was someone, the hermeneutic of continuity, not the hermeneutic of rupture, that whatever the church in any generation has to be the same church as it's always been. You can't jettison what the church has always taught for 2,000 years in order to be up to date. And so he understood the whatever time we're living in from the perspective of eternity, first of all, but then secondarily from the perspective of tradition, which is history, right? That we have to understand the church from the perspective of eternity, heaven. In other words, you have to understand the church militant from the perspective of the church triumphant, right? To see the church in time as part of the church in eternity. But you also, the church in time, you have to see in its entirety, right? The 2,000 years of history and teaching and lessons and martyrdoms and to be part of that living tradition. This is what Pope Benedict XVI lived, practiced and preached. And it's through that timelessness, this following of the Holy Spirit and not the spirit of the age, that his power, I think, actually prevails.
Let's talk about the traditional liturgy, because that was fundamental to him. In fact, as you're right, quote, when his brother George Ratzinger was asked in an interview what he considered to be the focal points of Benedict's pontificate, he singled out without hesitation the Pope's efforts to restore the traditional liturgy. Why was restoring the traditional liturgy so important to him, such a focal point, the focal point of his pontificate, and what steps did he take to achieve that restoration?
Yeah, so for me, what he achieved magnificently in the spirit of the liturgy as Cardinal Ratzinger is to reorientate our understanding of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, where we all need to be turning towards the Lord together, priest and people, and that it has to be an act of adoration and prayer, which is beautiful and is in keeping with the living tradition of the church. And if people could only just, I mean, quite frankly, if the spirit of liturgy was compulsory reading in every seminary in the world, we'd have a transformed and transfigured church within a generation, because it would bring together the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass in a way that both could be seen as worshiping the Lord authentically. So the Novus Ordo Mass needs to be ad orientem. You need to be turning towards the Lord. I mean, this is what Ratzinger said, and then of course in some more in Pontificum, he understood that he wanted, first of all, as an act of love, that Catholics who preferred the traditional Mass had been ghettoized, had been pushed into a ghetto and treated like second-class citizens in their own church. As an act of love, he wanted to bring them out of the ghetto, knowing that if he did that, then it would alleviate the certain type of ghettoized mentality which leads to anger. And we still see it, of course. A certain type of traditionalist does more harm than good because they're animated by animus, right, by anger. But he saw that if we just bring them out, and I go to traditional Latin Mass in our diocesan parish, and the demographic there, the average age of it's probably 20. Now that's brought down because lots of young children, but they're very much young couples, many of them converts with many children that have discovered, first of all, the Catholic faith, but then also the traditional liturgy. And same thing with where we live, with Little Oasis, because the Novus Ordo masses in many of the parishes are celebrated ad orientem. Altar rousing was brought back. Receiving communion on the knees is encouraged, and on the tongue is encouraged. Of course, the traditional liturgy, it's compulsory. And so I think that Pope Benedict and Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict realized that the key to the restoration and rejuvenation and regeneration and revivification of the church is to basically restore our traditional understanding of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And that, I think, has been borne out. You just have to look where the vocation's coming from, where are young people going to, where are there no vocations? Where are the congregations getting older and shrinking? I mean, it speaks for itself, and it takes someone who's blinded by some sort of modernist ideology to not see the obvious, which is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is where the people are authentically practicing the faith as people have always authentically practiced the faith.
But Pope Francis is concerned about the ghettoizing, as you said, in the other way, that people have used the traditional liturgy in order to separate themselves and to be conservatives and to separate themselves. I mean, where do you draw the middle line?
Well, I think that basically that Benedict XVI drew the middle line. That he wanted to see the Novus Ordo and the traditional, the extraordinary form of the Mass in communion with each other and in conversation with each other and in a cross-fertilization with each other. In other words, in conversation, right, not in schism. And I think trying to push traditional Catholics back in the ghetto, which is some of the recent moves I would suggest are in danger of doing that, is exactly how you bring about a schismatic problem. And the fact that far more people are practicing the traditional Mass now makes it a much bigger problem than it was. So the thing is that I think personally that this is the final shot across the bow of the aging Vatican II, spirit of Vatican II, spirit in inverted commas, spirit of Vatican II hippie generation who want to cling on to something which has been shown to be a failure for 50, 60 years, where the Holy Spirit has quite clearly deserted those who have deserted the traditions of the Church.
I see. And you believe that Benedict XVI's views on the beauty and the importance of the traditional liturgy will prevail?
Yeah, I think he says that the beauty of the liturgy is absolutely essential. And a good liturgy, Novus Ordo or extraordinary form of the Mass, it is celebrated with beauty, with adoration, edifies the soul, lifts the soul up to heaven. The definition of prayer, to lift the mind of the soul up to heaven. Mass should do that. We shouldn't go there and just feel as if we're being entertained by the priest who's cracking jokes. I mean, that's not what Mass is about.
Right. Okay, well, as we all know, of course, on February 11th, 2013, Pope Benedict shocked the world when he declared his abdication from the papacy, giving age and incapacity as the reasons for his resignation and expressing contrition for his mistakes. Now, Pope Benedict lived 9 years beyond after his resignation, in a health that, by all appearances, was even better than Pope John Paul's in the last years of his pontificate. Is it possible that there was more to it, as some people suggest, than just his health and his feeling that he was too old for him to carry on? And secondly, what were the mistakes that he was apologizing for, that he was calling for contrition?
Well, at this point we're being a little bit speculative,
Right.
and I want to prefix anything I say by
Right, and you don't talk about any of this on the book. It's just my...
Yeah. Obviously, I'm not a fly on the wall. I don't know for certain. I think that what Benedict was hoping is that a young, dynamic Pope would be elected who would clean house. I think it was St. John Paul II that I think it was St. John Paul II that was said to have said. Someone said to him, well, how many people work in the Vatican? And he said, about half of them. The point is, it's quite clearly that the curia, the bureaucracy in the Vatican and other stuff going on in the Vatican needs reform. And I think that's one thing that does need doing. We need to, clean house. And I think he was feeling too old, and also I think surrounded perhaps by people who were not sympathetic to what he was hoping needed to be done. And he thought, well, maybe if I get out of the way and we get some young Pope in who could clean house, that's what we need. And I'm getting too old for it. And in any case, I don't feel that I'm being listened to by those around me. That's my feeling. I also don't think he wanted to be Pope. That was quite clear. I think
He never did.
No, I think that when JP2 died, I think he was hoping to have a retirement, maybe spend more time with his brother. So he took it on as a cross, and then when he felt that he was not able to carry that cross any longer, or not able to do what was needed in the office, I think he thought stepping down was the prudential thing to do. But again, it's speculative. I'm not an insider, and I don't like conspiracy theories.
Sure.
The conspiracy theories are dangerous.
Right. So the only other Pope to ever resign from office before Benedict was Celestine V, which, as you write, was an extremely holy man. In fact, he had been a monk and a hermit. And so they placed him in that position. And as you write, he was woefully inadequate, weak. It was a mess. He was a disaster. And his brief pontificate lasted like 5 months. Now, he was canonized, but Dante in the Divine Comedy put him in the vestibule of hell for the great
Great refusal.
The great refusal. Now, Pope Benedict was also a very holy man, but unlike Celestine, it's generally agreed that he was a very good pope.
Yeah.
And some, like yourself, believe that he was a great pope.
Yeah.
What do you think history will say about his resignation? What will be the judgment on his resignation and on his pontificate overall?
Well, the first thing, I think that the irony and the humor of the situation is actually very illuminative of Dante's putting Celestine V in hell, because Dante's writing at the time, right? Dante's as close to Celestine V.
He's a contemporary.
Yeah, exactly, as we are to Benedict XVI, right? And the consequence of Celestine XV resigning was that Dante's enemy became Pope, right? So Dante's angry because the politics of the day, right, makes it look as if this was a disaster, right? But this is the danger. We're too close to see things as they really are, and ultimately the only purpose of life is to get to heaven. There is no other purpose to life except this: the quest for heaven, right? Celestine V might have been a failure as a pope, but he's in heaven. He's a saint, right? Benedict XVI, I honestly believe, will be canonized, but he wasn't a failure as a pope. So that it's a win-win. He did some very, very important things as pope that I think that the church 50 years from now will be actually reaping the positive harvest from. I think he sowed seeds in his brief pontificate that are actually going to bear fruit throughout the 21st century. I mean, and obviously, history will prove whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. But also, he was a holy man who had served the church very faithfully prior to JP2's papacy, then during JP2's papacy, and then as Pope. And I no doubt at all that he probably had lived a very prayerful life, doing great stuff spiritually, even after his retirement. That I think the man is in heaven already. Eventually, the church should not be hasty about these things, but will recognize that fact. And I certainly thank God for the great gift that Joseph Ratzinger was to the mystical body of Jesus Christ, the church.
All right. So let's turn now to your ambitious penultimate book, which came out last year, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions. Now, in this book you posit, and this is my words, not yours, correct me if I'm all off, but In the book, you posit that contrary to secular interpretations of history, whether in its Whig, Hegelian, Marxist, postmodernist, or any other version, history is, in fact, a tapestry woven from three perennial threads: the good, the bad, and the beautiful. What exactly are the good, the bad, and the beautiful, and how do they weave their way through the collective lives of men and women to make history?
Well, one of the motivations for writing the book was that there's a danger that from I don't like the term left and right, but just for the sake of this particular discussion, there's dangerous people on the so-called left that they believe that they're progressive. The world is progressing into a golden age in the future, inexorably brought in by human progress and science. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain type of, shall we say, reactionary who agrees with that, but thinks it's not a golden age in the future. It's hell on earth in the future, right? But in actual fact, if you look at history, the only progress that's being made is the progress to heaven by the individuals living in history or not. And what you see is the whole of history is either, the template for history is to be found in the gospel, right? That you have Christ, who establishes a church and the followers of Christ. That's the good. They have the bad, which is the bad outside the church, which is Caesar, in other words, secularism, the secular power. You have the bad inside the church, that's either the Judases, right, who they're either treacherous because of corruption or treacherous because of heresy, error. And then throughout every single century, you have the great works of art and beauty. And again, the book was inspired by words of Pope Benedict XVI, when he said, ultimately, the only defense for the Catholic Church are the saints she's inspired and the great works of art that she's inspired. So that's the good and the beautiful. And then there are those that are against the church, both either as Caesar or as Judas. So what the book has one chapter for each century, and there's a section on the good. So the saints, but not exclusively the saints. There could be other good things that are happening. The bad, essentially Caesar and Judas, and the beautiful. So what great works of visual arts, architecture, music, literature are being produced in each of these centuries as a witness to the glory of God's presence in human creativity. So that's the idea of the book, is to show that history is a time-woven tapestry of these three threads.
Yeah. Well, when I started reading the book, I started focusing. I did it by focusing on the good, the bad, and the beautiful, and in each century, because I wanted to know which one is the great century, which one are the good ones, and what are the bad ones. I wanted to find out, and I gave that up because it seemed to me pretty soon that there's no such thing. Even though we say there's a great century and there's an awful century, like when you see the greatest saints and the most beautiful, you see a century with the greatest saints and the most beautiful architecture, music, or literature, you see the most horrendous acts. Yeah. And at the same time, when you see like what we consider a bad century with very horrendous acts, you see great saints come forward, beauty come forward. Did I misread that? Am I missing something?
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. So it's often thought, by nostalgic Catholics that the 13th was the greatest of centuries.
A book was written about the greatest century.
Yeah, exactly. It is a good book, yeah. And it was a great century. Yeah. But in the 13th century, you've got the new religious orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans. Then you've got the great philosophers of Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure. You've got the rise of Gothic architecture, these beautiful, majestic edifices to faith. These basilicas and cathedrals going up across. But then you've also got, at one point, 3 people claiming to be Pope at the same time, and very, very confusing but at the time as to who's the true Pope here and who's the anti-Pope, and corruption. So, in
the fourth Crusade was at that point.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Terrible. That was demonic.
Yeah, exactly. And then you take what might have been considered the worst century by many people. What about the Reformation, the 16th century, 1500s?
The division of the church.
Right, you got the great rupture of the Protestant Reformation. That's bad, and no one's suggesting that's good. Although, it's even then as a but. The Catholic Reformation, often called the Counter-Reformation, right? The Catholic Reformation was a response to the Protestant Reformation and brought forth some of the most glorious things in the church. So certainly some of these new movements, so you've got the Jesuits come from this, you've got great saints like St. Charles Borromeo, you've got Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, the Reformation of the Carmelite order, you've got the growth of polyphony, the Palestrina and Thomas Tallis and William Byrd, and these great music, and of course you had the great religious art of the time. So in many and the great martyrs. So for me, another book I wrote just before that one was The Faith of Our Fathers: A History of True England. And for me, the as an Englishman, what part of England do I most admire? It's not the merry England of the Middle Ages, as wonderful as that was. It's the heroic resistance of the English Catholics to the tyranny under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I and James I, the English martyrs, the Jesuits who came back to England knowing that when they were arrested they would be tortured horribly and then put to slow, gruesome death. But they came back anyway to bring the traditional mass to the people of England. In some ways, that's the greatest of the English century because of their heroism of the saints and the resistance to terror. When things are going smoothly, Merry England, everyone's having parties and Corpus Christi and mystery plays. Well, that's wonderful, and thanks be to God for it. But it's not until you're now to the cross with Christ, though, that you really know the extent to which you are a follower of Christ.
Now, there's one thing that I didn't quite notice when I read it, but I heard you in an interview, and I said, "Oh yeah, that's right." And that is, at the worst moments of the church, when the Judases were sprouting and the betrayals were everywhere, it was at those moments when, at the grassroots, ordinary holy people were reviving the church, were cleansing it and making it beautiful and good again. Could you give us a couple examples of when that happened?
Yeah, well, so what seems the general sort of pattern is that when the church is successful in a worldly sense, it gets into bed with the devil, if you like. It gets into bed with Caesar or with Judas or with both, right? And you have a church that's now accepted by the world because it's become worldly. And it's almost as if God has to send us a healthy dose of persecution, right, so that saints can step up to the plate and show us what being a Christian really is. So, we look at the darkness of, I mentioned the 16th century already, but, we look at the very early church, right? The church is in the catacombs, right? Maybe we go back to the catacombs during the Soviet Union, during the 20th century, right? In China today, right? To me, it's when you see ordinary Catholics at grassroots level who are willing to die for Jesus Christ because Jesus Christ died for them. And that I think is the real test. Not, I'm a Catholic because good people are Catholics, and I consider myself to be a good person, right? That's not the spirit of Catholicism. The spirit of Catholicism is taking up our cross and being willing to lay down our lives for our friends and enemies.
So in a nutshell, when all is said and done, what is or what are the fundamental lessons that we should take from this, panoramic and granular presentation of history that you have presented us?
Well, first of all, there wasn't a golden age in the past, and there's not a golden age in the future. What this is the church militant, right? The church militant it means the church at war. We are Miles Christi. We are soldiers of Christ in enemy territory. And we see the whole template in the gospel, right? Jesus was crucified. But Jesus wasn't just crucified, he rose from the dead. We rise from the dead after death. And this is the other thing we need to remember, that we should see the church militant, show all of history, with the church in time, as through the light of the church triumphant, the church glorified. It's through the eternal triumph of Christ and his saints that we should be able to see the light on earth, and not in any other sense. So we must not become too embroiled in the politics of the day, the fashion of the day, whatever the latest ideas are of the day. We need to transcend that as Christians and try to see the whole of history in the light of the whole of history, right? But also in the light of Christ triumphant in heaven. And if we focus from that perspective, from the perspective of seeing the saints and wanting to be a saint and living as if we want to be saints and doing whatever that requires, which certainly does require taking up your cross and possibly being crucified, right? That if we don't have that sort of faith, then we are failing as Christians.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on now to your most recent book, Classic Literature Made Simple, 50 Great Books in a Nutshell. And here it's right there. As the subtitle suggests, the book is made up of short essays, briefly analyzing the meaning and the merits of 50 great works of literature. sins, and including Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. How did the book come to be, and why did it come to be? That is, what do you hope to accomplish with it?
Well, first of all, I want people, I edited another book called Poems Every Catholic Should Know. That I know that most Catholics are not able to sort of immerse themselves in the great works of beauty that have been produced. So we obviously talk about art, talk about architecture, we talk about music, but literature, the written word. We have 3,000 years of Western civilization. We have 2,000 words of Christian civilization, 2,000 years of Christian civilization. There are some marvelous works here. Most of us don't know them. I don't know them well. So what I want to do is to take 50 of these great works and to try to encapsulate in the nutshell in about 1,000 words or so. The gist, the most important moral dimension, or a perennial philosophically truthful dimension of each of these works. So the book actually wrote itself because I did a series for Crisis magazine, great literature in a nutshell. And when I got to 50, I stopped and then put them together in the book. So that's how it wrote itself. But that was the idea for the series, as it is also the idea for the book.
Now, in your introduction, you point out that there really aren't just two types of book, good books or bad books, but there are really four. Good books, bad good books, good bad books, and bad books. I found it very useful. Now I go to bookstores, and that's the first. Is that a good or a bad good? Tell us what those categories mean.
Yeah, so it's actually sort of an exercise in logic, okay? So a work can be, literature can be good as literature, but bad as morals, right? So you have a writer who's been given 5 talents. So he has the literary gifts, and they are a gift from God, but instead of, true art should be giving back to the giver of the gift, the fruits of the gift given, all right? That's what true art should be. It should be an act of prayer, an act of praise. But if we have these 5 talents that are given to us by God as a gift, but instead of giving it back to Him, we cast those talents like a pearl before swine, and we allow our talents to be a vehicle for our pride, right? Then it might be beautiful and therefore actually very enticing and alluring, right? Like a beautiful woman with bad morals, right? So a book can be beautiful but have bad morals, right? So a book can be good. It's beautiful and has good morals, or it can be bad good. It has bad morals, but it's beautiful, or it can be a good bad book, which means that it has good morals, but it's not very beautiful, right? It's not bad. It's badly written, or it can be bad moral and bad as.
We can discard with those, but the first 3
throw those ones away, And what I would say is that there are, thanks be to God, with 3,000 years of Western civilization, there are many good books. So certainly we should give those priority. But let me just say one thing, because I don't say it in the introduction, but I want to say this. I'm making a point. I own about probably between 100 or 200 21st century works of Catholic fiction, and also probably similar number of books of Catholic poetry. Now, I'm reading through those. If they're really bad, right, then I don't finish the book, right? But if they're good enough, I read them, and they might not be good, as in good, great, right? They can be good, very good morals, but not great literature. But they're not that bad. And so, I'm sort of equivocating a bit here, because I do think it's important for me and for us, if we want a living Catholic culture, we have to patronize the Catholic arts. So if there are new Catholic writers out there writing new Catholic novels, we should be checking them out, right? And there'd be very few of them are going to be classics like the classics, but for every one classic that's been written in any century, there have been 50 or 60 bad books. So the point is, there's nothing unusual about that. We need to be able to keep our finger on the pulse of what new writers are doing as well.
Can you give us one example of a good bad book, well written but bad morals?
Well, the one I often quote is anything really by James Joyce. James Joyce. I'd take The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man as an example. He writes beautifully. The man is a great writer. As a literary figure, I have no argument with the fact he's a literary figure. But he poisons what he's doing with his own pride, with his own rebellion. And it should leave a bad taste in our mouths.
As a professor of literature to undergraduates, do you teach good, bad books?
No, that's a great question. Again, I have. This is an argument, and I've had arguments with colleagues before. For instance, I taught for many years at Ave Maria University. a senior class on 20th century literature, I did not teach James Joyce, and I was actually attacked for not doing so. But my argument was that, well, what book am I going to leave off? Am I going to leave out Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton to make room for James Joyce, or Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh to make room for James Joyce? What do I have to? What good book do I have to sacrifice for the bad good book? Right. So, but I allowed myself to be prevailed upon, and I taught it for several years. And the argument was, well, if any of our students go on to grad school, right, and they haven't read James Joyce, they're going to be at a disadvantage.
Or even if they don't go to grad school, we'll read it.
Well, yeah, well, exactly. And I'm certainly not saying people should not read James Joyce, but if I can only have in a syllabus, let's say 4 novels and maybe 3 or 4 poets, 2 or 3 poets, right? I mean, what am I going to sacrifice to put James Joyce in? That was the question. So, I would rather concentrate entirely on good books, but I can understand the argument.
Now, one would assume that the 50 books that you include are good books. But, I was reading through them, and then I hit on a book, which by what you yourself say about it, it seems to me, wait a minute, I think this is a good bad book. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Would it be Paradise Lost?
That's it. That's it. I studied that in college, and it was a Christian professor who taught it, in fact. I never knew that he denied the divinity of Christ, but I always did find it a little surprising that his Satan was so heroic. It's a portrayal that has continued. People have imitated him in other books and films. And I thought, man, that's not good. Well, make the case. Why is it a good book?
Well, I don't think it is a good book.
So you included a good bad book.
I did include a good bad book, and you can accuse me of hypocrisy if you like. But in the same sort of argument that I've just used about James Joyce, that if Paradise Lost is one of the great books in the sense of not great in terms of their first of all great in terms of their literary merit. I'm not arguing that it's not a great book in terms of literary merit, but also great in terms of its influence and impact on culture. So in that sense, it is a great book, but it has, he doesn't believe in the Trinity. He believes that God the Son is a creature. In fact, a large part of Satan's animosity is jealousy towards this new kid on the block who's now the father's favorite. And of course, you say that they have this anthropomorphic Satan, very different from the one that Dante sticks.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I talked about that last time here. I mean, that's a beast in Dante.
He's a trapped beast and a ravenous beast who is insatiable appetite. He's an addict.
Yeah.
He's a mess.
Yeah.
Whereas Milton's Satan, he asks all the other demons, well, who's going to have the courage to do this one-man mission, right, into enemy territory, and they're all cowards. So he does it himself. Yeah. I mean, he's a hero. Right? Even if it's for a bad cause, he's a hero. So, it's not surprising that he's, Percy Shelley, the poet, said that Milton's Satan was so much the moral superior of his God. If people with a poetic sensibility such as Shelley can say that with an element of credibility, because other people agree with it, then there's a problem there somewhere.
Yes. All right, let's move on because we're running out of time, believe it or not. Now, 11 of the 50 books that you analyze are Shakespearean plays, which means that Shakespeare takes up more than 20% of your book. So let's give him his due here. Now, I'm sure that anyone who has read your book, Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, will agree with me when I say that in that book you proved way beyond a reasonable doubt not only that Shakespeare was Catholic, but I would add that he was a serious and committed Catholic to his dying day. I mean, I think it's unquestionable. And I say all that because in your analysis of these 11 plays, what you basically do is present the traditional secular interpretation of the plays and then present the plays through, Shakespeare's Catholic eyes.
Yeah.
Which is, you wrote a whole book about this, in fact. So let's do that here for time's sake. Let's just pick 2. So do that for Romeo and Juliet.
Okay. So again, Romeo and Juliet, the way that the world teaches it is that their love is beautiful, romantic love, and it's the problem of the adults that don't like each other. Whereas what Shakespeare is doing in that play is showing that if we allow our reckless passion to overpower our reason and our virtue, that disaster will be the consequence in both terms of hatred and in terms of erotic love, right? Which is love which is about appetite and desire, not about reason, not about self-sacrifice. And so we see it. We see certainly in the hatred that the Capulet and the Montagues have against each other, that they are clearly destroying each other physically and also morally through the hatred. But also in fact, the Romeo and Juliet basically recklessly pursue an ill-advised marriage without their parents' knowledge, let alone their consent, and then go headlong towards being the cause of each other's death. I mean, if anybody really thinks that well, let me give it just a symbolism very quickly, right? The death. So, first of all, Romeo commits suicide, and that's never in any of Shakespeare's plays seen as good. But when Juliet comes back from her
spell,
shall we say, as she sees that Romeo's dead, first thing she does is hope there's enough poison on his lips to kill her, right? This is not healthy. The metaphor for the first kiss is that sin is being transferred between them, right? And so poisonous sin is a recurring metaphor in Shakespeare, particularly in plays such as Hamlet. But then she stabs herself with Hamlet's dagger, and that is also a sexual metaphor, right? That basically that sexual relationship was deadly to both of them. And that's the play that Shakespeare's writing. He deliberately makes Juliet only 13 years old, a child. His own daughter is only 13 when he writes it. This is a play being written by the father of a teenage girl about the dangers of allowing passions to go to your head. And that's not the way it's taught, but that's the play that Shakespeare wrote.
Yeah. Well, let's do it for The Tempest.
All right, The Tempest. Well, again, the Tempest is an excellent play. What we see here is Shakespeare is showing the power of art in the power of Prospero to put things right. The very final speech of Prospero is Shakespeare's final bow, where he asks for prayers. But we see again, the way that the world teaches it is that Caliban is the Aborigine, the native of the island, and that's nonsense. His mother arrived on the island. It's a desert island. Nobody lives there. His mother, who's basically had sexual relations with the devil, right? So the mother's a witch who's had sexual relations with the devil, and Caliban, this monster of some sort, is the product who wants to rape Miranda, this innocent girl who's never seen a man except for her father, and doesn't repent, says, I would have done it too if you had stopped me, and peopled the whole island with my own people. And the modern world sees him as the hero, right? This person who is going to rape the virgin because of his hatred and his bestiality, quite frankly. And that's the way that the world treats it. That he's the victim, he's the native, and Prospero is the imperialist. Right. Whereas in actual fact, Prospero is the one who brings prosperity, who brings reconciliation. He was an exile, right? He and his daughter were exiled and actually presumed dead, thrown out from their own country. They're refugees, right? And not imperialists, they're refugees. But because of his art, which again is a metaphor for Shakespeare's own art, he can reconcile the warring parties. He forgives his own persecutors. He even forgives Caliban at the end of the play, right? Peace prevails everywhere. There's universal harmony. And yet the modern world, through its wokest agenda, somehow manages to make him the enemy and the villain rather than the hero of the piece.
So, with all the evidence that you lay out in your book, The Quest for Shakespeare, and with all the evidence that his Catholicism is present throughout his work, why do secular critics continue to ignore it, by and large, do you think?
Well, certainly it's an inconvenient fact. What they want to be able to do with Shakespeare, ironically, it's like a form of sola scriptura, right? That you want to be able to do what you like with the text. You don't want anybody saying, well, you need to read it through the authority of the author. The most authoritative reader is the authorial voice, the writer. Okay, if you want to understand what Shakespeare is doing with the play, try to understand it as Shakespeare understood it, which means you have to know something about Shakespeare. So that's why my first book was looking at the biographical evidence for who Shakespeare was, almost beyond any reasonable doubt, a believing and committed Catholic. And then, well, if that's the case, how is that Catholicism? Because it's our deepest held beliefs that will be made manifest in the work. Our deepest held beliefs are always our theological and philosophical beliefs. What do we think the meaning of life is, right? And that's going to manifest itself in our work. If Shakespeare's a believing Catholic, his works are going to be Catholic. If you try to see them as anything else, you're not seeing them at all. All you're doing is deliberately misreading. And I'm actually reminded of that great philosopher Jane Austen, right? Because, her book Pride and Prejudice, pride and those who advocate pride are always prejudiced. They don't want to see what's really there. They want to see what they want to be there, which is not the same thing.
Okay, finally, Joseph, if somebody wants to start a reading plan for the great books, I mean, this is a good place to start. But what should they do? I mean, is it necessary, essential that they do it chronologically from the beginning of the time of the great literature till now, or some other method? Okay.
Well, actually, what I hope for this book is that I hope that people will buy this book as a way of getting an introduction to 50 of the greatest books of Western civilization. But then they read these, and I'm hoping they will serve as appetizers. Yeah. And then maybe they read the 50, and there's 5 particular things that really interests me. And this will take them the 5 that they find most appealing. So it's like looking at a menu, right? And you read the menu, you read the 50 summaries. And they say, well, actually, I want that for my first course, that for my second course. And then hopefully that will develop a habit where they want to keep coming back and reading more.
And it's never too late.
Absolutely never too late. No.
All right. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure and an honor, as I said, and also for all your great work. It has brought a lot of us, I speak for myself, closer to the Catholic faith. And maybe someday will get us through the pearly gates. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. God bless you.